Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Leanne. I'm with the People's Forum, which is a political education and cultural center for internationalist and working class movement building in New York City. Of course, due to the global pandemic, our physical space is currently closed, but we are continuing our programming online. We're also currently running our first revolutionary summer school. I'm really excited about this, and I'm really happy to see that there's many participants in the summer school logged in with us today. If you aren't enrolled in the school, you can definitely still participate. We're sharing the curriculum and all the study materials as we go on a resource platform that you can access at politicaleducation.peoplesforum.org. We'll share that link with you. You can find readings and more supplementary material for this lecture, as well as an archived recording of this lecture on that site as well. So we're here today with Professor Marc Becker to learn about and discuss the revolutionary thinker, social scientist, and activist José Carlos Mariátegui. We can't overstate the significance of the contribution that he made to advance revolutionary theory internationally. He showed the way to engage Marxist theory from particular conditions of Latin America and specifically from the Andean region. And he also insisted that indigenous peoples need to take an active leadership role in the revolutionary struggles of the continent. Though he is one of the most important communist militants of Latin America, his life and political contributions are really not well known in the English-speaking world, and this is a huge loss. If you've been to our space in TPF or you've been to other events, you might have seen some of the t-shirts that we've printed that say, the South is our North. I love that slogan. I think it's a really important phrase to keep in mind. I think to engage in struggle without the guidance and the contributions of the great revolutionaries of the South would be a huge mistake. And so for this reason, I'm really grateful that Marc has agreed to join us today for this lecture. Marc Becker is a professor of Latin American history at Truman State University and a scholar of the Latin American left. Among his many publications, we have Forthcoming, the CIA in Ecuador, in 2017, the FBI in Latin America. Other titles are the 20th-Century Latin American Revolutions, José Carlos Mariátegui, an Anthology, Pachakutik, Indigenous Movements and Electoral Politics in Ecuador, Indians and Leftists in the Making of Ecuador's Modern Indigenous Movements, and Mariátegui and Latin American Marxist Theory. Marc, you can introduce yourself as well. And before we get started, to all who are joining, this is an interactive session. So we want your comments, we want your questions. If you're on Zoom, please submit any questions you have using the Q&A function, and we'll try to get as many as we can. If you're on YouTube, you can do the same using the YouTube chat. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and especially Marc, I'll pass it to you.
Great, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I always love talking about Mariátegui. Mariátegui has long been, I guess, my North Star, or South Star maybe, in terms of guiding me in my understandings of the world, more broadly than Latin America, in terms of how to think and how to process these ideas. Sorry, I wanted to put this up. This is all a new world for me. You can see the my PowerPoint right now. That's correct. Good. Okay. This is my contact information as well. If anybody wants to contact me, the best is always my email, mark@yachana.org. The Mariátegui is, like we said, one of these people that's really not well known in the United States, although in Latin America, he's really well known. And just as an indication of the role that he played, when he died in 1930, there was this huge funeral march. This is a picture of the funeral march that took him from his house to the cemetery, and this real outpouring. And Waldo Frank was a writer from the United States who wrote in The Nation, liberal New York magazine. And when Mariátegui died in 1930, this is what he said. that Mariátegui has died, and these words suffice to plunge the intelligentsia of all of Hispano-America into sorrow, and nothing could be more eloquent of the cultural separation between the two halves of the New World than the fact that for most of us, these words convey no meaning. And that's still very much true today, I think, is that Mariátegui is somebody who is really well known in Latin America, and we seem to keep rediscovering him and rediscovering him over and over again. And so this is maybe yet another rediscovery. Let me start. What I want to do here today is let me start with a little bit of a biography of Mariátegui, and then move to his ideas. And so this is an outline of his biography. That he was born in 1894 on the Peruvian coast. He was raised by a single mother. There's this whole theme that we can almost see throughout Latin America, that there are many of these people who come from really marginalized or single parent families and emerge as these leading lights. A couple things about his childhood that if we want, I don't know how significant this is, if we want to like psychoanalyze it in the sense or how important it is, but his mother was a deeply religious, conservative person, which on one hand maybe seems ironic that the leading Marxist thinker in Latin America emerges out of a conservative family. Maybe another way of looking at that, though, is that it maybe forms some of his ideas on religion, for example, that we'll come back to later. His father was the grandson of a liberal independence hero, and his mother separated from Mariátegui's father in order to prevent that liberal influences from tainting his ideas. And again, I'll come back and talk a little bit more about this later, but it's like those, he never really felt the need to reject religion, but rather religion was an important part of human existence. And so he talks about that. He's Mariátegui is a poor and sickly child. He suffers from tuberculosis. When he's 8 years old, he hurts his left leg. It cripples him for life. And he has few financial resources. Because of these lack of resources, he ends up needing to find a job. This is really common in Latin America. Survival strategies are common in any marginalized societies where you need to find a job in order to support your family. And so he goes and gets a job as a copy boy at a newsroom. You know, a copy boy is just somebody who picks up material that the journalists are writing and runs it around the newsroom. And from that, they recognize his talent. And so he begins to progress upward, where he begins to write, he begins to edit, and eventually he starts to launch his own newspapers. And so there's two things that come out of this. One is that he finds a livelihood. And so it's through journalism, through writing, that he supports himself. And the other side is that this is also how he expresses himself politically. So this becomes also a vehicle for his political expression. One of the newspapers he launches take an overtly pro-labor perspective. And this runs him in trouble with the Peruvian government. And in October of 1919, he's exiled to Europe. And that this, again, at this time, this is a really common way to deal with troublemakers is you just like send them off. And the idea is if you send a troublemaker like Mariátegui, who has a lot of promise, off to Europe, that it will be an opportunity to, like a finishing school, that he'll emerge from that as a more mature adult, and that will like tamper down his political agitation. Before he went to Europe, he later talks about this as being his Stone Age, where he never wants to go back to those early writings. And instead, he comes out of Europe, what he calls himself convinced and declared Marxist. It's politically a transformative experience for him. So he spends 3.5 years in Europe. He comes back to Peru, and when he comes back to Peru, he begins to work what's called the Gonzalo Prado Popular University. Manuel Gonzalo Prado was an anarchist in the 19th century, and these popular universities were really common at this point. These are kind of like extended like adult education schools for workers who wouldn't have otherwise an opportunity to get an education. And drawing on his experiences in Europe, he gave a series of lectures called The History of the World Crisis. And he's a very popular lecturer. And some people want to give him a teaching post at the main public university. And he can't get that post because he doesn't have an education. He only has an 8th grade education. He doesn't have the proper credentials. And so he sees himself as an intellectual at odds with the intellectual world. At the same time, he's arrested because of his political activities. There's a strong international reaction. He's released. He also has health problems. His right leg, which is his good leg, is injured. And so he spends the rest of his life confined to a wheelchair. His health is failing. And even as his health is failing, his political and intellectual activities begin to accelerate. And it's almost as if either in spite of his failing health, or maybe because of his failing health, that he didn't realize he didn't have long to live on this planet, that he needed to work rapidly. And so what I have here on the slide are some of his main contributions. Imauta is the most famous one. Here, let me show you Imauta. I brought some show and tell here. Can you see this okay? Does that show up? This is good. Okay, this is a facsimile. This is a re-edition. And this went through over about 5 years. This went through different editions. And so this is a journal which each issue is about that thick. The issues often have drawings, they have painting, they have art, they have literature, they have politics. It's what's called vanguardist literature at the time. It was a really common form of literature at the time. I don't know what a counterpart would be today. It's kind of like Harper's or Atlantic magazine in a way, if you're familiar with that. And so this is the vehicle that he used for expressing a lot of his ideas. This was very much of a highbrow. This is for an educated audience, and he's very much dedicated to a working class audience. So he started to publish a counterpart called Labor, which means labor. And it's an extension of that for a working class audience. And so this is, I don't know if this shows up well, but this was as a broadside newspaper that was like 4 or 6 pages long and written at a level that was really addressed to a working class audience. And this is again, another example of him trying to make his work accessible to a public audience. What Mariátegui is best known for more than anything is his 7 interpretive essays on Peruvian reality. And I just realized I forgot to bring my copy of that to my computer. I was going to do that. The 7 interpretive essays, as the title implies, these are 7 essays that talk about economics, problem of the Indian, land, education, religion, regionalism and centralism, and literature. And this is like a broad scope of Peruvian reality. And what people, some people have said that this is the one book that everybody should read to understand Latin American reality, very much of a fundamental sociological treatise for understanding Latin America. He published other things as well, but those are his most significant contributions. In terms of his political activities, he founded the Peruvian Socialist Party in 1928 and brought it into alignment with the Communist International. He's very much of an internationalist, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. And he, out of the Peruvian Socialist Party, which eventually became the Peruvian Communist Party after his death in 1930, he also founded the General Confederation of Peruvian Workers, Marxist-oriented trade union federation. And so he does all of this. All that I have on the screen is between his return from Europe in 1923 and his death in April of 1930. In like 6 or 7 years, he smashes a lifetime of work, way more than most of us accomplish in a lifetime in just a couple years. And so it's really at the height of his political and intellectual activity that he dies. So that's a really brief overview of his life. From that, let's go on then to his ideology. There's different ways of thinking about his ideology. This is how I come to see it, breaking it down into these 5 aspects. And I'll talk about each of these briefly. National Marxism, anti-imperialism, Agrarian Revolution, racial matters, and ending then with religion or a revolutionary myth that I talked about before. The National Marxism is really the theme that why a lot of us pay attention to Mariátegui, because of his taking these European ideas and adapting them to a Latin American reality. And so he's commonly seen as the first truly creative and original Latin American Marxist thinker. And if you think about this just for a bit, it's a really logical way of doing this. You're taking these ideas from a different context and assimilating them, applying them in an open and flexible fashion to your reality, not being rigid and deterministic, but what we call open and voluntaristic, of applying these ideas in new and creative ways. And so that's more than anything what Mariátegui is known for. And this is why, in a lot of ways, the model why we keep coming back to him is because if we can emulate this in terms of taking other people's experiences and ideas and applying them in new and creative ways, that we can maybe come up with better solutions. Okay, the second point here, anti-imperialism, and I want to talk about 2 things here, because there's both the internationalism but the internationalism is deeply bound up with the anti-imperialism, and in ways this maybe is a bit of, might sound like a bit of a contradiction, that Mariátegui is really determined to analyze things in his local Peruvian context, but he's also very much aware of an international context. And this is why he wants to bring the Peruvian Socialist Party into the Communist International, because he recognizes the importance of international solidarity. And for me, this is one of the themes there. In Imauta, in the journal that he published, common themes that run throughout here are the Mexican Revolution that had just happened in the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920 is a common theme in there. He's talking about other struggles like strikes of Bolivian tin miners. He, in his correspondence, he maintains all these contacts with revolutionaries around the world. And he's really aware of the pressure of US imperialism on Latin America. And he's arrested a couple times, and this is one understanding of why he was arrested, because he was criticizing US imperialist penetration into the Peruvian economy, and that the US embassy had put pressure on the Peruvian police to arrest him. He later in the 1960s, we talk about dependency theory, and many people look to Mariátegui's anti-imperialist and internationalist critiques here as a forerunner of dependency theory in terms of critiquing a neo-colonial economic expansion of US capital into Latin America. Neo-colonialism, meaning that the Latin American countries 100 years previous to that had received formal political independence, but yet the United States, first Britain and then the United States, controlled their economies so tightly that they had, that it was really those economic imperialist forces that determined the political and social and economic nature of these marginalized economies. As part of this anti-imperialism, Mariátegui was also deeply involved in international support for Augusto Cesar Sandino. In the 1920s, Sandino led a revolution against the US Marines that had occupied Nicaragua. And so there was a huge international movement, solidarity movement called Manos Fuera Nicaragua, Hands Off Nicaragua, that people like the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera were deeply involved in. And Mariátegui gave a lot of space and support to Sandino's struggle. And so these are the types of international activities that he's involved in and things that he's thinking about. Okay, my third point here, agrarian revolution or agrarian issues. And this is again an example of where we can see him applying his national Marxism. So if you're familiar with what would maybe be considered orthodox Marxist theory, the idea here is that Marxist revolution or socialist revolution will only emerge out of a highly developed capitalist industrial society. And so that's the context that Karl Marx is writing in Germany in the 19th century. And the idea here is that you need a fully developed capitalist economy before you can engage in the redistribution of that. And also that you need the emergence of a class consciousness that emerges among the proletariat on the factory floor working together. Marx, on the other hand, has very negative attitudes. He has very negative statements toward rural peasants. He talks about them as not being revolutionary, but being conservative, but being reactionary, holding back the wheel of history. One time calls them a sack of potatoes. And the idea here is that peasants are only concerned about themselves, not about the broader society. And that, and so that they're, rather than moving society forward in terms of having a broader social interest, they're just interested in themselves. And so Mariátegui turns this on his head and he says, well, at this point, Latin America is overwhelmingly rural society. There's almost no urban working class proletariat. He says, well, if we want to have a revolution and we want to do it as a socialist revolution, we don't have this working class base on which to build. But what we do have is a very active, very politicized rural, peasant, and indigenous base. And so his argument is that we can build on that. And so in many ways, he turns Marxism upside down. And this is one of the influences that he has on Latin American revolutions. Because if you look at Latin American revolutions, like the Cuban Revolution, for example, it's very much based on a rural base, and Central American revolutions in the 1980s as well. And so this is one way that we see Mariátegui's influence having a lasting impact on how Latin America organizes itself for a socialist revolution. A second factor here with Mariátegui's understanding of an agrarian revolution is that there's this very orthodox idea and some flavors of Marxism that society moves through a series of stages, starting with primitive communalism and going through slavery, feudalism, and capitalism before finally onto socialism and communism. And that you have to have each of those stages fully developed. And there's a much bigger debate here, but the argument is that you can't move from feudalism straight to socialism, that you need to have a fully developed industrial capitalism before you can move on to socialism. And so there's this orthodox Marxist wing in the 20th century that interprets Latin American reality as a feudalistic society and says that socialism is way off, hundreds of years off in the distance. And so what we need to first do is develop a fully developed industrial capitalist society. And then out of that, we can emerge, then we can start talking about socialism. Mariátegui, again, applying his ideas of national Marxism, he says that that type of mechanical thinking doesn't apply here in Latin America, because he says simultaneously we have all of these different stages. We have primitive communalism, we have primitive communalism, we have feudalism, we have capitalism. We have these different modes of production existing simultaneously. And I could go into more detail in terms of like breaking this down, but what he says is because we're dealing with a different environment here, Latin America doesn't move through these stages like Europe does, but we can take the advantages of all of these different modes and move from these different modes of production directly to socialism. And so that in a way relates to the next point that I want to make here, and this is racial matters, and specifically the role of indigenous peoples in Latin America. And this again is a very large theme that we could spend a lot more time on unwrapping this if you want. But in terms of these modes of production, what he says is that Marx has this idea that peasants are isolated onto themselves and don't develop a shared society. But what he says is in Peru, you have remnants of the primitive communalism. It's called the Ayu, that comes out of the Inca Empire, that society is still organized on this communal basis, and that we can leverage, we can take advantage of this communal basis in order to develop socialist ideas. He says, unlike the European peasants that are just individualistic, he says the Peruvian peasants aren't like that. They're more interested in a communal society and are willing and wanting to work on that basis of a communal society. There's other things at play here as well. Part of it is, let me just say one thing about this. In 1929, there's a conference of Latin American communist parties in Buenos Aires, and they have debates about a range of topics. And one of the fiercest debates, and it was an unresolved debate, was around racism in Latin America. And one of the issues here was questions of what's called indigenous nationalism, that the Comintern wanted to create an indigenous nation in South America, and Mariátegui disagreed with that. And he made what appears to be much more of an orthodox class-based argument, saying that that the problem of Indians is not a racial problem, it's a class problem, that it's based in the economics of how society is put together. And this is an argument that this is an article from The Nation that was published in 1929 called The New Peru. It's just like a page and a half. It's a really short statement where he summarizes his ideas on the role of indigenous peoples in the socialist revolution. And he talks about in here where other people have put forward ideas about how to solve what's called the Indian problem, the problem of indigenous poverty. And he says often these solutions fall out along the lines of, well, they need to be educated, or they need to be converted to religion, or we need to come as philanthropists. And all of these ideas of like the white savior complex of people parachuting in and solving these problems. And he says, no, all of those reformist solutions are fundamentally missing the point here, that the problem is an economic issue of who owns the land and how that land is distributed, is run. And and so the more I think about Mariátegui here, in many ways, he is talking about what we today would call intersectionality. And I think a fairly complex notion of intersectionality, and this is how I come to understand these ideas. It's not like he's debating which is more important, whether it's racial oppression or class exploitation or gender issues. He says these are topics that are working on fundamentally different levels, addressing completely different issues, and we have to engage all of them. And I think this is something, I think this is an early example of somebody trying to embrace a much more complex understanding of how to address and overcome multiple forms of oppression in society. Okay, so finally, and the last point here is religion or the revolutionary myth. And again, we have what I come to see as this mythology in ideas of Marxism, that Marxism is inherently atheistic. You know, this quip that religion is the opiate of the people. Michel Lowy has this interesting essay that he published like 20 years ago in Science and Society, where he dismantles this and says that this isn't at all a Marxist idea on one hand, that it predates him, and two, it's like a really superficial understanding that it's more complex idea than that. And it's an interesting way to frame how Mariátegui thinks about this. And there's a couple elements to that. And so on one hand, what Lowy says in his essay, his understanding of Marx is, he says that, well, religion is a crutch because, you know, if you're injured, you need a crutch. It's something to get by. It's just like more of an observation rather than a critique than anything. On a second level, Mariátegui is very critical of 19th century liberal anti-clericalists. Just to back up to frame this a little bit, in terms of Latin American ideologies, what we call conservatism comes out of the colonial period and is closely associated with the Catholic Church. In the 19th century, liberals emerge advocating for separation of church and state and individual rights. And one of the key aspects of this liberal idea are anti-clericalism, against the institutional power of the Catholic Church, because that Catholic Church is so tightly associated with their political enemies, the conservatives. Mariátegui has no patience for that liberal anti-clericalism. He calls it a bourgeois pastime. He says, if you're worried about anti-clericalism, you're missing more fundamental economic issues, structural issues that are at play here. You're wasting your time. And so people have debated about this again. Some people will trace this back to his very religious conservative mother, that he, out of respect or out of the influence, that he never felt the need to reject that, her religious background. And so there, you can do some psychological debates about that. I think that maybe something else was going on there. But another thing that he's talking about, though, he says, what moves people to action? Do dry economic boring theses move people to action, or does emotion move people to action? And he says religion understands something that Marxism traditionally hasn't, and that's the role of emotion and moving people to action. And that's why he ends up, and that's why I put on here, religion, revolutionary myth. This is what he talks about. So he doesn't really so much talk about religion, but he talks about the revolutionary myth, about how religion taps into the same thing that this mythology, this idea of motivating people to action does. And so that becomes like a really key part of his ideas. And this is one of the influences that some people would say is, again, one of his key influences, that in the 1980s, liberation theology emerged as a strong force in Central America. I mean, just a little bit of history here. There was a Peruvian theologian named Gustavo Gutierrez, who in I forget now, 1969 or 1971, he published a book called A Theology of Liberation. And he uses Marxist tools of class analysis to do a theological reflection on lived realities. And so people will point to that as a synthesis of Marxism and Christianity. And this has a really strong influence in revolutionary movements in Central America in the 1980s. And so you have people like Ernesto Cardenal in Nicaragua recently died. And he's maybe the primary example of this. He says that there's no contradiction between my Marxism and my Christianity. It's like I'm a Marxist because of my Christianity. And so this fundamentally, for some people, fundamentally changed some people's notions of the role of religion. In these Central American revolutionaries came to Cuba. The Sandinistas and the FMLN in El Salvador were the most famous. To Cuba, that was a very much of a secular society, and they kind of surprised the Cubans that they were religious, and they said, no, there's no contradiction here, that there's more of a synthesis. And so we can have a broader debate here about the role of religion in a Marxist movement, but a lot of this traces back to Mariátegui's ideas of saying that he sees no need in order to reject the role of religion in society. There are other interesting influences and overlaps that emerge out of this. If any of you have seen Che Guevara's, the movie about Che Guevara, The Motorcycle Diaries, there's a scene in there where he meets this doctor in Peru, and Hugo Pesce, and Pesce gives him a copy of this book, 7 Interpretive Essays of Peruvian Reality, and there's a quip in there where Che Guevara is reading this book. And so this is like an early influence in 1953 on Che's ideas. That Hugo Pesce, who gave Mariátegui that book, or gave Che Guevara that book to read in Peru when he was traveling through on his motorcycle, is the same person who brought and presented Mariátegui's ideas on race to the communist conference of Latin American communist parties in Buenos Aires in 1929 and said, look, we have racial issues here we need to deal with. Later, Che married a Peruvian, Hilda Gadea, who also at that point was a more mature Marxist thinker than Che was, and also really influenced a lot of Che's ideas along a lot of these themes, including religion. It's like saying that, you don't need to be so antagonistic. Che came from a very secular, very anti-clerical liberal family. And Hilda Gadea kind of changed some of his attitudes on a variety of these themes that emerge out of Mariátegui. And so for me, this is a bit of an interesting emergence of how these ideas flow together and come together and emerge in terms of these alternative ways of understanding Marxism in Latin America in new and creative fashions. So I'm going to stop there. And we'll open it up to questions, right?
Yes. Thank you so much for this overview, for the context and outline of his contributions. So I have a few questions to start us off with. I also see, so for those who are on Zoom, we can also try something that we don't usually do. You can use the raise hand button and I can enable your microphone so you can pose your question directly. But I'll start us off with one that's come in, and then anyone who's watching, please submit any of your questions via the Q&A or raise your hand if you're on Zoom. So unfortunately, this question asks, unfortunately, José Carlos Mariátegui is not well known in the US. He understood and argued the need to connect issues of race, particularly indigenismo and class. What do you think we can draw in our current anti-racist struggles from Mariátegui's theoretical and ideological contributions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've thought the last couple years more and more about intersectionality And I think Black Lives Matter, I think there's trends in Black Lives Matter that would be really, really consistent with what Mariátegui says. And it's a sophisticated understanding that how would you say this? The struggle is much larger than race, but race has everything to do with it. And that's something that Mariátegui, I think, would innately understand of Black Lives Matter, and I think would fully embrace its mature demands, particularly in terms of understanding. Let me back off and answer it maybe in a slightly different direction, because he had no patience for racial nationalism, because the Comintern wanted in Latin America to create an indigenous republic of Quechua and Imauta people. And he said, that's ridiculous. National development is way too developed here. You can't take these people off. And if you do that, what you're going to have is like the Bantustans like you see in South Africa. You're going to give them the worst land. You're going to have what happens if you give Puerto Rico its independence. It's like, bye-bye, good luck. You don't have any industrial base. We've screwed you over. And now you can't do anything about it. He says that, and furthermore, he says that if you created an indigenous republic without addressing underlying class issues, you would just reproduce the class hierarchy and exploitation. And so he says that he's fully committed to indigenous liberation, but he says that an indigenous ruler in our indigenous government in and of itself will not solve the problem. And I think we see that in the United States, right? That we don't need to just elect people of color, because if you end up with somebody like Clarence Thomas, you haven't solved anything. And this is what Mariátegui understood. He said, you know, you need people like AOC who understand the class structure of society, these structural problems, and so you need to have more of a sophisticated intersectionality.
Thank you so much. So we have some questions coming in. One from Selena. Could you talk more about his mother's political influence on him? Other sources say that his father left his mother, and your analysis seems like an important departure from this. What was her political life like, and how did that influence him? I'm also wondering about his wife, Ana Chiape, and her role and influence on his political life.
So then I think that you, if you've written anything about this, I would love to see it, because that is a question I keep thinking about. And this is, these women just disappear in this history, and nobody talks about them. And I don't know where to find the information. So if you have better sources of information, I would love to see them. His wife, he met her in Italy and married her in Italy and came back, and she died before I had a chance to meet her. But I talked to people who knew her at the end of her life, and Mariátegui was so iconic, and she seemed just to want to preserve that iconic status. And I think it really does a disservice to people like both his mother and his wife, who obviously were people with their own ideas, and they live in the shadow of somebody like Mariátegui. But at the same time, we know how influential they were. And I think methodologically, this is probably one of the limitations of what I'm a historian. What we do as history is we base the stuff on written records, and Mariátegui wrote voluminously. Just to give you an idea, this is maybe 25 years ago, his family published his collected works, and these are like 2 volumes of his writings. And so this is what we base these studies on. And so we have, from a historical framework, we have less to go on for his mother and his wife. And I think that's a really important topic. I applaud the question. We need more work along those lines. I don't have a good answer, sorry. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah.
We're getting a lot of questions coming in. I hope we can get to all of them. So Linda's asking, how did Indigenous leaders and intellectuals view Mariátegui in the past and the present?
That's a fantastic question. And it's a really good follow-up on the last question, because I don't have a good answer. And again, this is a methodological problem with myself as a historian. This is, again, this is years ago. I wanted to do more of a study of where the Communist International got this idea of creating an indigenous republic in the Andes. It's like, who came up with this idea? Did they ever bother to ask any indigenous peoples in the Andes, do you really want to be your own separate republic? Or what do you want? And that project got shortened for a variety of reasons. But and so we just have some tantalizing ideas. And again, we need different methodology that's not historically based to uncover those voices. The one thing that I would say, and I don't know whether this is valid or not. I was in Ecuador in June of 1990, when there was a huge indigenous uprising, and there was a whole reaction against outsiders speaking for indigenous movements, indigenous peoples. And Mariátegui, he was an outsider. He was in Lima on the coast, speaking about people up in the mountains that he had, in ways, only indirect contact with. And so I started asking my comrades in Ecuador, it's like, well, how do you feel about Mariátegui? Because he was also an outsider who's advancing all of these ideas about indigenous liberation. And this is 1990, you know, this is like 70 years after he died. So this is way later, but I still have anybody who I would consider to be a serious indigenous intellectual today who is very critical of Mariátegui, that they see him again as a guiding light, somebody who had really good ideas for how to develop this. And the other thing is that Mariátegui never put himself up as the white savior complex. He has a famous quote where he says, indigenous communities are waiting their Lenin. He was looking for a leader to emerge out of the communities, and he would point to specific events and saying, we are seeing this emerging out of the communities. And so we talk about allyship, our comrades, and I think Mariátegui is maybe an example of that, who's somebody who knew when to step back and how to amplify the voices of others. And so that's that's maybe something that we can maybe try to learn from people like him.
Thank you. There's a question that maybe ties to this. Given that Peru was mostly an indigenous population during Mariátegui's time, and he wrote about Peruvianizing Peru and emphasized the indigenous question, how much did Mariátegui's thought influence the Bolivian process led by Evo Morales?
My understanding is that all of these, not only Evo Morales, but other pink tide governments across Latin America look to Mariátegui as a guiding light. Mariátegui becomes one of these like symbols that everybody wants to occupy him, not only in Peru, but at least across South America. I've seen other people from different ideological persuasions claiming Mariátegui as their forebearer. And in ways, it's easy for people to do that with Mariátegui. He died in 1930 before some really deep fractures happened in the international communist movement. Before the Leon Trotsky, for example, defected. And so it's really easy to see Mariátegui as a forebearer of everybody. And because he's been dead for 90 years now, it's like he can't come back and bite us if he doesn't like how we're using his ideas. But so the simple answer would be that yes, he is a very clear influence there. The other thing that I would say, though, about that is that when he was alive, particularly his journal Imauta distributed internationally. And I've talked to comrades elsewhere in Latin America where they talk about that they were waiting for this journal to show up in their mailboxes. And it always amazes me how well this information distributed. So it's not necessarily like there's like jumps here. I think some of his ideas influenced his counterparts in Bolivia because he had all these connections with them. And so it's not a direct line from Mariátegui to people like Evo Morales. It's a chain, like from Mariátegui to his contemporaries into Bolivia, that feeds internationally and creates this whole idea that we see culminating, I think, in some of these contemporary political expressions.
Along that line, also from another question from Rocio, which other Latin American thinkers do you think have carried Mariátegui's thought into their writings today? And could you recommend anyone?
I always need to look at my bibliographic database to come up with citations. Maybe the other mole. I blank on authors and titles. A Brazilian sociologist wrote this great book maybe 5-10 years ago now about the New Left, The Other Mole. Alvaro Garcia Linera, and the vice president, who was the vice president under Evo Morales in Bolivia, is also somebody who very much would see himself in the Mariátegui traditions. I know some people would challenge that interpretation. But see, if you drop me an email, I'll think more about it and give you like a reading list. I'd be happy to do that. Those are maybe two key. Boaventura Sousa Santos. He's Portuguese, but he has really close connections with Latin American social movements. He's written a lot of really good things. He would be another really good person who would broadly fall into this tradition. I'll think of more people.
Great. Yes, it can be hard to recall on the spot. So another question, when thinking of repression these days and the amount of times Mariátegui was arrested and exiled, what kind of lessons do you think we have from this experience? And another question following up to that is thinking about things like Reforma Agraria in Peru and the impact of his thought on that process.
On the first question, maybe don't be afraid of tear gas. I don't know if that's right. Tear gas can kill you. It's not less than lethal, depending on what happens. But it really based on fear. And it's not just Mariátegui. There other people. When I read about the histories of comrades in South America, it always surprises me that I must be really a wimp here in terms of not wanting to get arrested, because these people were constantly arrested. And in my new book, The CIA in Ecuador, that's just coming out, I tell one story about Nela Martinez, who was arrested in 1950 something. And I have like a whole part of a chapter where I talk about her arrest. And what's stunning is that when I read this in the contemporary accounts that I have, it seems like a fairly big deal. In her autobiography, she doesn't mention it at all. And so either that means that this oppression was so common that after a while it doesn't register anymore, or maybe more so. Mariátegui doesn't talk a lot about these arrests. I think maybe a more important thing is it's like they don't see themselves as victims. It's like, it's not, oh, poor me. It's like the struggle isn't about me. The struggle is about these larger structural issues. And so let's focus on that rather than worrying about what happened to me. And sorry, the second question, in my mind, it was a different question. So it was about agrarian reform. Could you repeat it again?
Submitted at the same time with the same person. Okay. About let me give it the proper. So thinking about things like Reforma Agraria in Peru and the impact of Mariátegui's thought on that, and possibly how it did not live up to what people had expected.
Yeah, I wish I had a better short answer to that, because it in Peruvian history, in 1969, General Juan Velasco famously implements an agrarian reform that he names after Tupac Amaru, a leader from centuries earlier, under the slogan, the masters will no longer feed off of the poverty of the the peasants. And in the sociological literature, there's a whole debate about what these agrarian reform programs were like. And some people are adamant that they were designed to benefit the ruling class. Other people said that they're just implementing a capitalist mode of production, perhaps as a necessary step to move on to socialism. And other people are adamant about that this was due to insurgent subaltern peasant pressure demanding these reforms. Almost universally, these agrarian reform programs were less than successful, in part because of a lack of resources for seeds, for training, stuff like that. And maybe also a problem often is that they come from the outside rather than emerging from inside. One of the, maybe the most inspiring example that I've ever seen of people trying to implement Mariátegui's ideas is the Movimiento de Trabalhadores Sem Terra, the landless workers movement in Brazil. And there's variations in this movement, but there's one particularly radical movement that has really different ideas, non-capitalist ideas about not treating land as a commodity. But it's like this idea of Mother Earth, that we live on this, we have to take care of it, we have to respect it, we can't exploit it. And Mariátegui talks about ayus, this traditional way of communal organization in the Andes. And I think if Mariátegui were alive, particularly in the 80s and the 90s when MST in Brazil really came online, I think he would really embrace that model of saying, we're looking, yes, at people coming together and doing this themselves, not a government doing it for them. And but on the other side, the problem is, as long as you have a government, an antagonistic government in power, they're going to try to dismantle your experiments. And that's why we have Jair Bolsonaro right now in Brazil. This is a right-wing ruling class backlash against things like the MST, who are trying to implement Mariátegui's ideas. History doesn't move in a linear line, I guess.
Thank you. So we have, let's see, we have a question that's kind of actually a question about Marxism from Diane. Marx did have an open mind, or was willing to rethink about stages society has to go through. For example, his analysis regarding Russia, where society was more communal. Is this similar to the situation in Peru?
Yeah, Diane, I'd completely agree with you on that point. There's who's sorry, I blank on things off the top of my head. The sociologist who wrote in the early 60s about, like, he had 4 different flavors of Marxists. I can't recreate this off the top of my head, like dead Marxists, open Marxists. And I think you probably know who I'm talking about. And I think we have stereotypes about Marx that the more deeper I delve into Marx, I don't think are real. That I think that Marx had a much more dynamic mind. The more I read both Marx and Mariátegui, I don't see that there's a tension. I think that they really fall in line with each other. So I think we would agree with how we see their ability to try to understand and interpret their realities. I don't think Marx would have any problem with Mariátegui. I think Marx would fully admit that, yeah, it's like, sure, I don't know anything about South America. We need people like you to analyze your society. And in many ways, this goes back to what Gustavo Gutierrez is doing with liberation theology. He's taking Marxism as a tool of analysis in order to critique our society, not being locked into like a deterministic way of seeing that things have to go like this, but working openly and dynamically and critically. That, and this is often a problem that we have on the Marxist left, that we don't want to question and criticize our ideas. And there was once a quip from Cuba that they should pay us to criticize the government, that we need more criticism. It's like from that criticism that we emerge. And I think that type of criticism is one thing that both Marx and Mariátegui wanted to engage in and would encourage their followers to do, to not just apply these ideas mechanically.
Similar question to this, investigating the understanding of religion and Marxism that you posed earlier. So this is from Jonathan. My understanding of Marx's take on religion is that it is complex and performs an important function. The full quote reads, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. He wants to understand where the difference is, if there's a difference between Marx and Mariátegui.
Like I said, a lot of my ideas about this are really influenced by an article that Michel Lowy published in Science and Society, I think in 1998, where he really unwraps some of these ideas. And I don't know that I can, particularly here, that I can really do justice to that. If I remember right, Lowy doesn't write specifically about Mariátegui in that essay, but he has a couple other essays that he's published in Latin American Perspectives, where he talks specifically about Mariátegui and religion, and has some really good ideas. But the Jonathan that was his name, right? The quote that he had in his entirety is, I think, an important quote to keep in mind. And this is the point that I was trying to make, that that I'm understanding, my understanding of Mariátegui's view of religion are really channeled through Lowy's interpretations. And Lowy talks about how that this sigh is alienation of the human existence. It's not a clerical conspiracy. And so that's how he sees it. From my perspective, and I may be reading too much into Mariátegui here, I think Mariátegui, as really a materialist thinker, is saying, we can't deny emotion, but we also can't ignore structural issues. And so if you get too caught up with the religious question, you're ignoring the material structural realities in which we're living. And so that's a theme that he keeps coming back to, that yes, religion is important, moving people's spirits is important, but emotion is not going to solve the world's problems, that we need to have material solutions to the world's problems. And I think both Marx and Mariátegui, again, I see them agreeing on this point, really. I don't know, that this maybe be a good discussion to have with Jonathan in person back to back at some point. We should do it sometime.
That would be great. So a question following up on an earlier question that invoked the phrase Peruvianizing Peru. In your opinion, what are some of the threats and opportunities to Latin Americanize Latin America today?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you repeat it?
So an earlier question invoked Peruvianizing Peru, and this question is asking, are there threats or opportunities to taking a similar framework, Latin Americanizing Latin America today?
I think I'd have to think more about that. I'm not somebody who has really delved deep into what Mariátegui really means by Peruvianizing Peru. There's different people will read and interpret Mariátegui on different levels. I read him more on the level of intellect, ideologue, of political theory. And he also wrote a lot about literature. And people who talk about Peruvianizing Peru often read it more in the genre, or in the framework of his literary ideas. And so off the top of my head right now, I think the only thing I would have to say is maybe something that really probably is way too trite, in that we need to understand Latin America on Latin America's terms, and that solutions for Latin America have to come from Latin America rather than outside, and not to push Latin America into an external framework. That's my understanding of what Mariátegui was talking about when he meant Peruvianizing Peru, like not taking European models and forcing Peru into those European models, but allowing Peruvian solutions to emerge from the ground, from native populations. Yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer.
That's great. So this maybe you already answered it in some ways, but this is, I think it's a strong question. Given the imperialist offensive going on around in the continent and around the world, what is the importance for revolutionaries to study Mariátegui's thought and contributions today?
Yeah, Mariátegui is one of these people who I don't know if I came out of a different framework, but I was raised with this idea that the world is always getting better, a progressive linear idea, and Marx kind of had a similar ideas. And when I go back and read Mariátegui and look at what he was doing, it's like, oh my God, he was like so far farther ahead than we are today, how we lost so much ground in 100 years. And so I could say a couple things about that. One, at that point, there was a really strong anti-imperialist network, anti-imperialist league that Mariátegui was involved in. And so that international organizing against imperialism, that international solidarity is something that I think is more important today than ever, and that we don't have as good of those international connections as Mariátegui had in his period. And so that international solidarity, I think, is a really key aspect. And the other thing that I would say is that it's Mariátegui's Marxist grounding in a materialist understanding of modes of production in terms of understanding neo-colonialism. And I think if Mariátegui were alive today, he would look at what's happening in Venezuela and Bolivia in particular, and he would say, oh, duh, it's like clear, this is what's happening. You have like these economic interests that are clearly preying on these countries, and those economic interests are determining these political outcomes, and these political outcomes are not in favor of the people in those countries, and that the only way to confront that is by an international movement. At the World Social Forum a couple of years ago, Alvaro Garcia Linera, the vice president of Bolivia, who was facing criticism for not moving more quickly to socialism in Bolivia, he said, you can't make socialism in your backyard. It has to happen globally or it doesn't happen at all. And that's one thing that Mariátegui definitely understood, is that, and I think that's why he wanted to be part of an international movement like the Anti-Imperialist League and the Communist International, because he says that we're talking at global international forces here, and we have to address it on a global level. And even though he's rooted in this national reality, he says that there are these global factors, and we have to address them on that level.
Thank you so much. I think that this is a great note to end on. And I think there's been many questions, but I think this is a good place to pause. I want to thank you, Marc. If you have any other final things that maybe you wanted to share.
No, yeah. Here, should I put? Can I put my email back up here again? That if anybody wants to drop me a note, that's the last line there, marc@yachana.org. Yachana means in Quechua and in the Inca language. And so, yeah, I'm willing to continue discussions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we'll share your contact with the participants in our summer program. You can also go to the website politicaleducation.peoplesforum.org to get some of the readings that were referenced, and check out the YouTube channel for other lectures. Marc, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today and to start our study of this very important revolutionary thinker, and hope to have you back again soon.